Moments before my military wedding, a retired Army sergeant shoved me into a fitting room and whispered, "Colonel, whatever you hear, don't come out." 30 seconds later, my fiancé walked into the shop. I was standing there in my Army dress uniform, one sleeve still pinned my heart, knocking against my ribs like somebody had fired a starter pistol inside my chest. The place was called Dawson's Military Tailoring, tucked between a barber shop and a dry cleaner off Murchison Road in Fayetteville, North Carolina. If you've ever been around Fort Liberty, you know the kind of place I mean. Old brick front brass bell over the door-framed unit patches on the walls, and coffee that tasted like it had been made during the First Gulf War. The owner, Frank Dawson, was 72, maybe 73, retired Army sergeant, lean as a fence post, white haircut, close shoes polished, even though he hadn't worn the uniform in years. Everybody trusted Frank. Young soldiers came to him before promotion boards. Retirees brought him uniforms that smelled like cedar closets and old memories. That morning I had gone in for one last fitting. "My name is Emily Carter, 46 years old, Colonel Logistics Officer." I had spent most of my adult life moving people, equipment, medicine, fuel, and sometimes hope from one place to another. I could plan a convoy route through 3 countries, but somehow I had convinced myself I could plan a second marriage without checking every road sign. My fiancé Daniel Whitaker was supposed to meet me later at the chapel for the rehearsal. He was charming in that polished way some men are when they've learned exactly how long to hold eye contact. He sold commercial real estate in Raleigh, wore expensive cologne, and called me M in front of people like we were already in a Christmas card. Frank was adjusting the cuff on my jacket when the bell outside gave the smallest little rattle. Not a ring, just a warning. He froze. I looked at him in the mirror. Frank. He stepped past me and looked through the narrow gap in the front curtain. His face changed. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. Then he turned, grabbed my elbow, not rough but firm, and guided me into the fitting room. "Colonel," he whispered, "whatever you hear, don't come out." I almost laughed. "Excuse me." He put one finger to his lips. Before I could argue, the front door opened fully and Daniel's voice filled the shop. "Frank, you old dog," he said. "Tell me she hasn't picked it up yet." I stopped breathing. Frank walked back out like nothing had happened. I stood behind that curtain, one hand over my mouth, listening. Then Daniel said his first sentence, and everything I thought I knew about the man I was about to marry shifted under my feet. I pressed myself against the wall of the fitting room, hardly daring to breathe. The curtain didn't quite reach the floor, and through the narrow gap I could see the polished toes of Frank's boots as he walked toward the front counter. "Morning, Daniel," he said in his usual steady voice. "Morning, you still make the best uniforms around here." "I appreciate that." There was a pause. Then another voice entered the room. I recognized it immediately. Mark Henderson, Daniel's best man. Mark was an accountant from Raleigh. We'd had dinner with him and his wife several times over the past year. Quiet, polite. The kind of man who always remembered birthdays and insisted on picking up the check. What was he doing here? Daniel laughed softly. "So today's the big day." "It sure is," Mark answered. "I've got one more thing to double-check before she signs everything." My stomach tightened. "Signs everything?" Frank said nothing. I imagined him standing behind the register pretending to organize receipts while listening as carefully as I was. Daniel lowered his voice, but the shop was small. "I don't want any surprises after the honeymoon." Mark chuckled. "You really think she'll question the paperwork?" Daniel actually laughed. "No." He sounded almost amused. "Emily reads military logistics contracts all day. Personal paperwork, she skims it." I felt my face grow hot. He wasn't guessing. He knew me. Or at least he thought he did. Mark asked, "And once the wedding's over?" "We'll update the trust." "What about the lake cabin?" "It'll be ours." "Mine." The cabin belonged to me. A modest place on Baden Lake inherited from my parents after my mother passed away. It wasn't a mansion, just a peaceful little house where I'd spent every 4th of July since I was 10 years old. Daniel had always called it our happy place. Apparently he'd meant something very different. Mark hesitated. "You sure she's okay with combining everything?" Daniel snorted. "She thinks marriage means sharing." Another laugh. "I think marriage means planning." For the first time in 23 years of military service, I felt completely helpless. I'd faced mortar attacks overseas. I'd coordinated evacuations during hurricanes. I'd delivered casualty notifications to families. Yet hearing those calm, casual words through a fitting room curtain hurt more than I could explain. The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It sounded like 2 men discussing weekend golf plans. Frank finally spoke. "You boys need anything else today?" "No," Daniel replied. "Just wanted to make sure the uniform looked good." "It does."
"Good."
A chair scraped across the floor. I heard footsteps moving toward the door. Then Daniel stopped. "Oh, one more thing." My heart hammered. "If Emily comes by before the ceremony, don't mention we were here." Frank answered without missing a beat. "I don't discuss my customers. That's why I like you." The bell above the door jingled. Silence settled over the shop. I stayed exactly where I was. A few seconds later, the curtain opened. Frank looked older than he had 10 minutes earlier. He didn't say a word. Instead, he walked to the front windows, turned the sign from open to closed, locked the door, and pulled down the shade. Only then did he look back at me. "I'm sorry, Colonel." I couldn't speak. Finally, I managed one question. "How long?" Frank rubbed the back of his neck. "I've had my suspicions for months." "You knew—" "I knew something wasn't right." He reached beneath the counter and held up a small digital recorder. I started recording when I recognized his truck. I stared at the device. "You have all of it." He nodded slowly. "Enough." I sank into one of the fitting room chairs. The wedding was only 4 hours away. And for the first time in my life, I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. Frank drove me out the back alley behind his shop in his old gray Ford F-150. Neither of us said much. He turned onto Bragg Boulevard, then merged toward Interstate 295. The radio stayed off. The only sound inside the truck was the rattle of loose change in the cup holder and the air conditioner fighting the North Carolina humidity. About 10 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of the Hampton Inn on Skibo Road. "You shouldn't go home yet," he said quietly. I looked at him. "Why?" "Because if Daniel notices anything's different, he'll change his story before you've had time to think." He was right. For 23 years, I'd been trained not to make major decisions while emotions were running high. The Army had taught me that panic usually led to mistakes. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was my life. "I'll be fine," I told him. Frank didn't argue. He simply handed me the digital recorder. "Make a copy." I nodded. "And Emily," I looked up. "You don't owe anyone a performance today." Those words stayed with me long after he drove away. The room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and laundry detergent. I hung my dress uniform carefully in the closet, then sat on the edge of the bed. For almost an hour I stared at the wall. I kept replaying Daniel's voice. "She skims it. Not Emily. Not my fiancé. Just she." As if I were another business transaction. My phone buzzed. "Daniel." I let it ring. A minute later, another message appeared. "Everything okay? Running behind?" Then another. "Love you. Can't wait to marry you." I actually laughed. It surprised me. Not because it was funny. Because I'd never heard words sound so empty. Around noon, my younger sister Rachel called. She lived outside Charlotte, taught 8th grade history, and had spent our entire childhood protecting me despite being 6 years younger. The moment she heard my voice, she knew something was wrong. "What happened?" I told her everything. Every word. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then she exploded. "Call the wedding off." "I know." "No, Emily, right now." "I know." "What are you waiting for?" I rubbed my forehead. "I'm thinking." "Thinking—" "He doesn't know I know." Rachel sighed. "I swear the Army rewired your brain." "It probably did." "You don't need a strategy." "I do." "No?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment before speaking more softly. "What are you afraid of?" I looked toward the window. Across the parking lot, a family was loading beach towels into an SUV. Life was continuing as if mine hadn't just fallen apart. "I'm afraid I'll make a decision I'll regret." Rachel understood immediately. She'd been with me through my first divorce. She knew I wasn't afraid of losing Daniel. I was afraid of becoming someone ruled by anger. "Then promise me one thing," she said. "What?" "Whatever you do, don't let him write the ending." After we hung up, I opened my laptop. Instead of searching for wedding cancellation policies, I opened 3 tabs. The first was for my longtime financial advisor in Raleigh. The second was for Fort Liberty legal assistance. The third was my personal email. I began forwarding copies of every document Daniel had ever asked me to sign over the past 6 months. There were more than I remembered. Insurance forms, draft trust agreements, property paperwork, retirement beneficiary updates. At the time, they had seemed ordinary. Now they looked different. Patterns started appearing. Most of the changes benefited Daniel. Very few protected me. I wasn't a lawyer. But I'd spent enough years reviewing military contracts to recognize when someone kept steering every conversation toward signatures. By 3 o'clock, my attorney called back. She agreed to meet me immediately. After reviewing the first few documents, she looked over her reading glasses and asked one question. "Colonel Carter, did you authorize these revisions?" I shook my head. "No." She closed the folder. "Then I think your wedding may become the safest place to expose all of this." I blinked. "The wedding?" She nodded. "Everyone he wants to impress will already be there." For the first time that day, I stopped thinking about canceling the wedding. I started thinking about finishing it very differently. The next morning, I woke up after maybe 2 hours of sleep. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I saw my army dress uniform hanging in the hotel closet, perfectly pressed inside its garment bag, and reality came rushing back. I showered, put on a pot of weak hotel coffee, and opened my phone. Daniel had left 9 missed calls, 4 text messages, 1 voicemail. I listened to it while staring out the window. "Hey, Em, just checking on you. Rachel said she couldn't reach you either. Everyone's asking where you are. Call me okay, I love you." His voice sounded warm. Concerned. Convincing. If I hadn't been standing behind that fitting room curtain the day before, I would have believed every word. I deleted the voicemail. Not because it hurt, because I didn't want to hear another lie. At 10 o'clock, I met with Sarah Klein, the civilian attorney I'd been referred to through Fort Liberty. She spent nearly 90 minutes reviewing every document Daniel had emailed or placed in front of me over the previous 8 months. Finally, she leaned back in her chair. "Emily, none of this is illegal by itself." I frowned. But together," she tapped the stack of papers. "It paints a picture. A picture of what? A man who slowly positioned himself to benefit from nearly every major asset you own." She wasn't dramatic about it. She didn't have to be. Facts carried enough weight. The trust revisions. Tap. The cabin. Tap. The retirement beneficiary changes. Tap. The survivor benefit discussions. Another tap. Individually, they're ordinary. She looked at me over the top of the file. Together, they suggest planning. I thought about Daniel's words inside the uniform shop. "I think marriage means planning." Now they sounded even colder. Sarah slid the papers toward me. "You have 2 choices. I'm listening. You cancel the wedding today. And the second, you let him believe nothing has changed." I already knew which one I wanted. The harder one. By early afternoon, I arrived at the chapel on Fort Liberty. The honor guard was already rehearsing outside. Families laughed in the parking lot. Someone was carrying folding chairs. A little girl chased bubbles across the lawn while her grandfather pretended he couldn't catch her. Life looked beautifully ordinary. That almost made me cry. Daniel spotted me before I reached the entrance. "There she is." He wrapped me in a hug. For one terrifying second, I forgot myself. Muscle memory almost made me hug him back the way I always had. Instead, I smiled. Just enough. "You okay?" he asked. "I barely slept." He laughed. Neither did I. For very different reasons, I thought. "You look beautiful." "So do you." It wasn't entirely a lie. He looked exactly like the man I'd fallen in love with. That was the hardest part. Betrayal doesn't always change someone's face. Sometimes it only changes the way you see it. Inside the chapel, the wedding coordinator handed me a clipboard. "We just need your signature confirming the ceremony schedule." Daniel reached for a pen before I did. "Here, sweetheart." I took it, then deliberately handed it back. "I'll sign later." It was the first document I'd refused to sign in months. I watched something flicker across his face. Just for a second. Then it disappeared behind another easy smile. "No rush, no rush." Those 2 words told me more than he realized. He wasn't nervous about marrying me. He was nervous about timing. That evening, we held the rehearsal dinner at a small banquet room inside the Mash House Brewing Company in Fayetteville. Friends from my unit came. Retired officers. Neighbors. Rachel arrived from Charlotte just before dinner and squeezed my hand under the table without saying a word. Then the door opened. Frank Dawson walked in wearing a navy blazer with a tiny army lapel pin. Daniel smiled as though greeting an old friend. "Frank, glad you could make it." Frank smiled politely. "Wouldn't have missed it." Only I noticed the small black folder tucked beneath his arm. Inside it were copies of the security recordings, timestamps from his surveillance system, and every receipt proving exactly when Daniel had visited the shop. No one else in the room knew it. But the most important guest at my wedding wasn't the groom. It was the quiet old army sergeant sitting near the back, patiently waiting for the truth to have its turn. "I barely touched my dinner," Rachel noticed. She leaned toward me and whispered, "You haven't eaten since yesterday." "I'm not hungry." "You're about to face the biggest moment of your life." I gave her a tired smile. I've had bigger. She raised an eyebrow. Bigger than exposing your fiancé in front of 200 people. I thought about Iraq, Afghanistan, flood relief in Louisiana, the soldiers I'd sent home, the families I'd stood beside. No, I admitted quietly. Not like this. Rachel reached over and squeezed my hand. You don't have to prove you're strong all the time. I looked across the room. Daniel was laughing with several officers from Fort Liberty telling one of his polished stories. Every few seconds he'd glance toward me and smile. Anyone watching would have said we looked like the happiest couple in North Carolina. Appearances can be remarkably convincing. After dinner, guests slowly drifted outside. Some lingered over coffee. Others gathered in the parking lot catching up with old friends. Frank walked over carrying that same black folder. "Colonel," he said softly. "You got a minute?" Rachel looked at me. "I'll give you two some privacy." The three of us stepped onto a quiet patio behind the restaurant. Frank rested both hands on the folder before opening it. "I owe you something." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He removed a faded envelope. Inside was a photograph. The edges had yellowed with age. I looked down. Daniel, standing outside Dawson's shop. Beside him, a woman I had never seen before. She wasn't dressed casually. She was wearing a wedding dress. I frowned. When was this? About 3 years ago. 3 years. That was nearly a year before Daniel and I met. He was getting her dress uniform altered. Frank slowly shook his head. No. He brought her here because she was getting married. I looked back at the picture. So, Frank took a long breath. She never did. I looked up. What do you mean? The wedding was canceled 2 days beforehand. Why? I don't know. He hesitated. I only know what happened afterward. He opened another folder. This one contained handwritten notes. I started keeping these after a while. After a while, Frank nodded. Because she wasn't the only one. The word settled between us. What are you saying? I've owned this shop for 34 years. He glanced toward the parking lot where Daniel was still laughing. I've watched thousands of military weddings. He paused. But every few years, he tapped the folder. I'd see the same pattern. I felt my pulse quicken. A successful service member. Usually older. Usually divorced or widowed. They'd meet someone charming. They'd move fast. The paperwork always seemed more important than the relationship. I stared at him. You think Daniel's done this before? I don't know. You just showed me a picture. I know. But suspicion isn't proof. He wasn't trying to convince me. He was trying to keep me grounded. That was one thing I respected about Frank. He never exaggerated. He only said what he knew. I contacted the woman in the photograph last night. I blinked. You what? She lives in Tennessee now. What did she say? Frank looked directly at me. She called off the wedding after discovering her fiancé had quietly convinced her to rewrite her estate plan. I felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Was it Daniel? No. So why show me? Because the methods were almost identical. I leaned against the brick wall. So this isn't about one man? No. Frank closed the folder. It's about people who learn exactly how to earn trust, then slowly turn that trust into money. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been haunting me. Frank, yes. Why did you help me? He smiled sadly. My wife served 28 years in the Army Nurse Corps. I hadn't known that. She died 8 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. He looked toward the American flag flying outside the restaurant. I couldn't save her from cancer. His voice caught for just a second. But if I could stop another soldier from being betrayed, he looked back at me. Then maybe I'd still be doing my job. I swallowed hard. The anger I'd been carrying since yesterday hadn't disappeared. But now it had changed. This wasn't only about revenge anymore. It was about making sure the truth had witnesses. Tomorrow wasn't just my wedding day. It was the day the lies would finally run out of places to hide. I didn't sleep the night before the wedding. Not because I was afraid of what I was about to do. Because I kept remembering the man I thought Daniel was. At 3:30 that morning, I gave up trying. I slipped out of bed, put on jeans and a gray sweatshirt, and drove through the quiet streets of Fayetteville. The city was still asleep. Traffic lights blinked yellow. A few delivery trucks rolled toward grocery stores, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a bakery near Hay Street. Instead of heading to the chapel, I found myself driving toward one place that had always settled my mind: the Airborne and Special Operations Museum. The grounds were empty except for a maintenance worker watering flower beds. I parked and sat on a bench facing the bronze statue of soldiers moving forward together. I wasn't there to admire history. I was there because I needed perspective. For 23 years, the Army had taught me something simple. You never made decisions based on your pride. You made them based on the mission. Somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten to apply that lesson to my own life. My phone buzzed. It was Daniel. Again. I ignored it. A minute later, another message arrived. "Can't wait to see you today. Love you." I stared at the screen. Not long ago, those words would have made me smile. Now they looked like lines from a script. I deleted the message without replying. Around 7 o'clock, I met Sarah Klein at her office one last time. She handed me a neat folder. "Everything's ready." Inside were copies of every document. The trust revisions, the property records, emails, timelines, even transcripts from Frank's security recording. Sarah looked at me carefully. "Emily, yes. You still have time to walk away." "I know." "You don't have to prove anything." "I know." She folded her hands. "What do you actually want?" Nobody had asked me that. Not Rachel. Not Frank. Not even myself. I thought for a long moment. "I don't want revenge." She waited. "I want the truth to arrive before the vows do." Sarah smiled. "That's a much healthier reason." "I hope so." She closed the folder. "Then don't lose your composure today." "I won't." "No matter what he says." "I won't." She pointed at me with her pen. "And don't improvise." That almost made me laugh. I've spent my career following operations plans.
Good.
Today is just another operation. She smiled. Except this time, I'm rescuing myself. By late morning, I was back in my hotel room getting dressed. I slipped into my Army service uniform one piece at a time. White shirt, black tie, blue coat, the familiar weight of ribbons across my chest. For years, that uniform had reminded me of responsibility. Today, it reminded me of something else. Self-respect. I studied myself in the mirror. The woman looking back didn't seem heartbroken. She seemed tired. Older, wiser than she had been 48 hours earlier. Rachel knocked softly before opening the door. She froze. "You look..." She couldn't finish. I smiled. "Old..." She laughed through watery eyes. "No." She stepped closer. "You look like someone who already knows how this story ends." "I don't." "You kind of do." She straightened my collar. "I've been thinking." "That's dangerous." She rolled her eyes. "You know what I mean." "I do. If you decide at the last second that you don't want to go through with this..." She stopped. "I'll drive you anywhere." I hugged her. Maybe a little longer than usual. "Thank you." "For what?" "For reminding me I still have choices." Just before noon, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Daniel. It was Frank. "Colonel?" "Morning, Frank. I wanted you to know something." "What?" I wasn't the only one who listened to that recording. My heartbeat slowed. "What do you mean?" I asked another retired sergeant to hear it. "Why?" I wanted someone with no connection to either of us. And he looked at me and said, Frank paused. "If that were my daughter, I'd want the truth told before she married him." I closed my eyes. That was all I needed to hear. I picked up my dress cap, looked at it for a second, then set it back down. Today I wasn't hiding behind rank. I wanted Daniel to look directly into my eyes when everything fell apart. I grabbed the folder Sarah had prepared, took one long breath, and walked out the hotel door toward the chapel. The chapel at Fort Liberty had never looked more beautiful. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching the polished wooden pews and the rows of white lilies lining the aisle. Outside, the honor guard stood at attention in crisp Army dress uniforms. Friends, family, neighbors, and fellow officers filled the room with the familiar sound of quiet conversations and nervous laughter. To everyone else, it was a wedding. To me, it felt like the final briefing before a mission. I arrived 15 minutes early. Rachel walked beside me carrying my bouquet. She didn't say much, she didn't need to. As we reached the bride's room, she stopped me. "Last chance." I smiled gently. "To run, to choose yourself." "I already did." She nodded. "I know." She kissed my cheek and stepped outside, leaving me alone. For a moment, I simply stood there. My reflection stared back from the full-length mirror. The Army service uniform fit perfectly. Frank had done remarkable work. Every ribbon sat exactly where it belonged. The silver eagle on each shoulder reminded me of every sacrifice that had carried me to this point. Today, that uniform wasn't about rank. It was about dignity. There was a soft knock. Daniel stepped inside. Tradition said we weren't supposed to see each other before the ceremony. Apparently, he wasn't worried about traditions. "Can I steal 60 seconds?" he asked with an easy smile. I forced myself to smile back. "I suppose." He walked over slowly. "You look incredible." "Thank you." "I can't believe today's finally here." Neither could I. He reached for my hand. His palm was warm, steady. If I hadn't heard that conversation 2 days earlier, nothing about him would have seemed unusual. "I know you've been stressed," he said. "But after today," he squeezed my hand, "everything's going to be ours." There it was. Not our life, not our marriage, not our future. Everything. He probably didn't even realize he'd said it. I looked into his eyes. "What if things don't go according to plan?" He laughed softly. "They will." The confidence in his voice was almost unsettling. He kissed my forehead. "I'll see you out there." Then he walked away. The door closed. I stood perfectly still. Rachel stepped back inside a few seconds later. "You okay?" I nodded. He just gave himself away again. What did he say? "Everything's going to be ours." She shook her head. He really can't help himself. "No." I picked up my bouquet. "He can't." At exactly 1 o'clock the music began. The guests rose together. The honor guard presented arms. The chapel fell silent. The heavy wooden doors opened. I took my first step down the aisle. Every face turned toward me. Some smiled. A few wiped away tears. Near the front sat my commanding general, several retired officers and friends I'd served beside for years. Near the back, Frank Dawson quietly watched from the last pew. Our eyes met for just a second. He gave the smallest nod. Nothing more. That was enough. Daniel stood beside the chaplain, looking happier than I'd ever seen him. As I reached the altar, he whispered, "You made it." I answered just loudly enough for him to hear. "Yes, I almost thought you might get cold feet. I almost did." He chuckled. "I'm glad you didn't." So was I. The chaplain welcomed everyone and spoke about commitment, trust, and lifelong partnership. Each word landed differently now. Trust. Commitment. Honor. The irony wasn't lost on me. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The chaplain smiled warmly. "If there is any reason these two should not be joined in marriage..." He paused. "Speak now." Silence. Daniel relaxed. He actually smiled. I slowly turned toward the congregation. Then I looked back at the chaplain. "There is." Every head in the chapel lifted. Daniel stared at me. "What?" I took one steady breath. "Before we go any further," I looked directly at Frank. "There's something everyone here deserves to hear." "There is." I wasn't shouting. I didn't have to. My voice carried through the chapel with the calm confidence that comes from years of briefing commanders and leading soldiers. 200 people who had been smiling only seconds earlier suddenly fell silent. Daniel blinked. "What are you doing?" I turned to the chaplain. "I'm sorry for interrupting the ceremony, Chaplain Harris, but I can't stand here and promise my life to a man who hasn't been honest with me." The chaplain looked from me to Daniel, then back again. He stepped aside without saying a word. Years of counseling military families had probably taught him that some moments couldn't be rushed. Daniel forced a laugh. "Emily?" His smile looked practiced now. "This isn't funny." "I agree." I laid my bouquet on a nearby chair. "Not funny at all." He took a step toward me. "If you're nervous, we can..." "I'm not nervous." I opened the dark blue folder Sarah had prepared. "I'm finished pretending." A murmur spread through the congregation. Rachel quietly stood and moved beside Frank near the back of the chapel. Frank carried a small black speaker no bigger than a lunchbox. He walked forward slowly. Daniel frowned. "What is this?" Frank didn't answer. He simply placed the speaker on a small table beside the altar. I looked at Daniel. "Do you remember stopping by Dawson's uniform shop 2 mornings ago?" His expression changed, only for a fraction of a second. "But I saw it." "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." He looked toward Frank. "You recorded me," Frank answered calmly. "My security cameras record every business day." Daniel laughed, but it sounded forced. "This is ridiculous." I nodded. "It is." Then I pressed play. Static filled the chapel for one brief moment. Then came the unmistakable sound of the bell over Frank's shop door. A few guests exchanged confused glances. Then Daniel's voice echoed through the speakers. "Frank, tell me she hasn't picked it up yet." My heart pounded, even though I'd heard it before. The chapel became so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming above us. The recording continued. "I've got one more thing to double-check before she signs everything." Someone in the 3rd row gasped. Daniel's face lost its color. He stepped toward the speaker. Turn that off." Nobody moved. His own voice filled the room again. "She skims it." Another pause. "The cabin will be ours." Several people slowly turned to look at Daniel. His best man Mark stared at the floor. The recording ended a few seconds later. No dramatic music. No shouting. Just silence. The kind that follows the truth. Daniel swallowed hard. "You've taken that completely out of context." "Have I?" He looked around desperately. "I was talking about our future." I opened the folder. "Then perhaps you can explain these." I handed copies to the chaplain. Another set to my commanding general. Another to Daniel's parents. Property revisions. Trust amendments. Beneficiary forms. Every document had dates. Every revision favored Daniel. Sarah had organized everything into a simple timeline that even someone seeing it for the first time could follow. Daniel's father adjusted his glasses. "What is this?" Daniel grabbed the papers. "They're draft documents." "No," I said quietly. "They're documents you asked me to sign without explaining what had changed." His mother looked back and forth between us. "Daniel..." "It's not what it looks like." Mark finally spoke. "Actually..." Every head turned toward him. He looked sick. "I told you we shouldn't have talked about it in the shop." Daniel's eyes widened. "Mark..." "I never wanted this." His voice cracked. "I thought you loved her." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "You said you'd keep your mouth shut." "I tried." Mark looked at me. "I'm sorry." The apology wasn't enough to erase what he'd done, but it was honest. For the first time all day, someone besides me was telling the truth. Daniel looked around the chapel. Nobody was smiling anymore. Not his parents. Not our friends. Not the officers he'd spent months trying to impress. The image he'd worked so hard to build had collapsed in less than 5 minutes. He reached toward me one last time. "Emily, please." I took a small step back. "No." My voice stayed calm. "You didn't lose me today." I looked him straight in the eye. "You lost me the moment you decided my trust was worth more than my heart." No one applauded. No one cheered. This wasn't a movie. People simply watched a man face the consequences of his own choices. And somehow, that was even more powerful. No one moved for several seconds. The chapel that had been filled with excitement only minutes earlier now felt strangely heavy. Someone near the back quietly began crying. Another guest reached over and took her husband's hand. Chaplain Harris slowly closed the folder of documents. "I believe this ceremony is over." His voice was gentle. No anger. No judgment. Just quiet certainty. Daniel looked around the room as if he expected someone to rescue him. Nobody did. Not his parents. Not his coworkers. Not the officers he had spent months trying to impress. Not even Mark. Mark stood alone near the front pew, staring at the floor like a man who had finally realized how much damage silence could cause. Daniel turned back toward me. "Emily..." I held up one hand. "Please don't. I can explain." "You've had months to explain." "I made mistakes." I nodded. "Yes? But I love you." Those 4 words landed differently now. Not because they were impossible. Because they were too late. "You may believe that," I said quietly. "But love isn't measured by what someone says when they're caught." His shoulders slumped. "I never wanted to hurt you." I smiled sadly. "And yet, here we are." His mother slowly walked toward me. Her eyes were filled with tears. "I'm so sorry." She looked genuinely devastated. I had no idea. I believed her. The woman had welcomed me into her family from the very beginning. She'd mailed me handwritten recipes, knitted a blanket for my granddaughter, and called every Sunday just to check in. She wasn't part of Daniel's deception. I gently hugged her. "This isn't your burden to carry." She cried quietly against my shoulder. I thought he was raised better than this. So did I. When she stepped away, she turned toward her son. "I don't recognize the man standing there." Daniel lowered his head. He didn't answer. Guests began leaving the chapel in small groups. There was no gossip, no dramatic whispers, just quiet conversations between people trying to process what they had witnessed. Several of my fellow officers stopped to shake my hand. None of them offered pity. One simply said, "You handled yourself with honor." Coming from a man I'd served beside for almost 15 years, those words meant more than he probably realized. Rachel walked over carrying my bouquet. "What do you want to do with these?" She held up the white lilies. I looked at them for a long moment. "Take them to the VA hospital," she smiled. "I think someone there would appreciate them." "I think so too." Frank quietly packed away his speaker. I walked over. "You saved me." He shook his head. "No, you listened." He closed the case. You saved yourself. For the first time since all this began, I laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, just enough to remind me I still could. I almost didn't. But you did. He smiled. That's what matters. A month later, the legal process was well underway. Sarah discovered additional emails Daniel had conveniently forgotten to mention. Several financial documents he'd hoped I would sign were withdrawn before they became official. Nothing criminal, but enough to protect everything that belonged to me. Daniel called dozens of times. I never answered. Eventually, the calls stopped. Mark sent me a handwritten letter apologizing for his part in everything. He admitted he'd ignored his conscience because he didn't want to lose a friendship. I wrote back only once. The next time your conscience speaks, listen to it before someone gets hurt. Then I wished him well. Holding on to bitterness felt too much like giving Daniel free rent inside my mind. I was finally ready to move forward. Not because justice erased the pain, but because the truth had given me permission to leave it behind. A year later, I found myself standing in the very same uniform shop where my life had quietly changed. The brass bell above the door rang as I stepped inside. Nothing much had changed. The old wooden counter was still covered with measuring tapes and fabric samples. Framed unit patches still lined the walls. A fresh pot of coffee sat on the warmer, filling the room with that familiar smell I'd come to associate with honesty instead of heartbreak. Frank looked up from a sewing machine and smiled. "Morning, Colonel." I smiled back. "Not anymore." He chuckled. "Old habits?" 3 months after the wedding that never happened, I retired from the Army. 24 years in uniform. Thousands of soldiers. More deployments than I cared to count. When my retirement ceremony ended, people asked whether I planned to relax. I honestly didn't know. For the first few weeks, I wandered around my little cabin on Baden Lake, wondering who I was without morning briefings, command meetings, and soldiers knocking on my office door. Then one afternoon, Frank called. "I've got a young captain in here," he said. "She's getting married next month. So, I think she could use someone who's been through a little more life than she has." That conversation changed the direction of my retirement. Before long, I began volunteering with military family support programs around Fort Liberty. I spoke with young officers, enlisted couples, and military spouses about finances, trust communication, and the importance of reading every document before signing it. I never turned my story into a lecture. I simply told the truth. Sometimes afterward, someone would quietly pull me aside and say, "I needed to hear that." Those moments meant more than any medal I'd ever received. One Saturday morning, a young lieutenant came into Frank's shop to pick up his dress uniform. His fiancée stood beside him holding a wedding checklist. They reminded me of another couple who had once stood in the same place. The lieutenant laughed as Frank carefully adjusted his sleeve. "Sir," he joked, "I guess perfection takes time." Frank smiled without looking up. "It usually does." Then he glanced toward me. For just a second, the two of us remembered that terrible morning a year earlier. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. Some stories belong in silence. Before I left, I thanked Frank one more time. He looked almost embarrassed. "I still say I didn't save you." "You gave me a chance to save myself." He nodded slowly. "I can live with that." Outside, the North Carolina sky was bright and impossibly blue. I climbed into my truck and drove toward Baden Lake with the windows down. The road felt lighter than it had a year ago. So did I. People sometimes ask whether I regret that wedding. The answer surprises them. I regret trusting the wrong man. But I will never regret learning the truth before I promised him the rest of my life. Looking back now, I realize the finest uniform I ever wore wasn't special because of the ribbons on my chest or the eagle on my shoulders. It was special because it reminded me to live by the values it represented: integrity, courage, and respect. Those values didn't leave me when I retired. If anything, they finally followed me home. If you've ever had to walk away from someone you loved because the truth demanded it, I hope you know you're not alone. Sometimes the hardest decision becomes the one that gives you your life back. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I hope you'll join me again for another story. The end.